My name is Jasmine, and at 34 years old, I learned that the vows of marriage mean nothing to a man who only loves your bank account. I was severely ill with pneumonia, struggling to draw a single breath, when my husband decided it was the perfect time to leave for a 36-day European vacation with his mother and sister. He did not just leave me behind to suffer, he hid my life-saving medication, shut off the main water and power, and engaged the smart locks to ensure I could not leave the house. He left me in a suffocating oven to die, assuming he would return a wealthy widower. What he did not know was that I am a forensic accountant who liquidates hidden assets, and I had a secret safety net he knew absolutely nothing about. If you have ever survived a betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect you, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe to hear exactly how I dismantled his entire life. The story begins in the suffocating and unbearable heat of a completely dark house. I woke up gasping for air, my lungs burning as if they were filled with crushed glass. My clothes were drenched in cold sweat, and my head pounded with a fever that had been steadily climbing for 2 days. I had been battling a severe case of pneumonia, the kind that leaves you too weak to stand without your knees buckling. I reached a trembling hand toward my bedside table, desperately searching for the emergency inhaler and the specialized antibiotics my doctor had prescribed just yesterday. My fingers fumbled over the smooth wood, finding nothing but an empty surface. Panic began to set in as I forced my heavy eyelids open. The ambient glow from the window revealed that my medication was gone. My inhaler was gone. In their place sat a single piece of crisp white paper, folded neatly in the center of the nightstand. I grabbed it, my hands shaking violently, and I dragged it close to my face to read the familiar, elegant handwriting of Derek. The words on the page made the blood freeze in my veins. "You are just being dramatic to ruin our trip. We need this European vacation. I have turned off the main water and power to save money while we are gone. The smart locks are engaged. Sweat it out. See you in 36 days. I read the words 3 times, my feverish brain struggling to process the sheer cruelty of his message. My husband of 4 years had not just abandoned me in my most vulnerable state. He had calculated every detail to ensure my suffering. I pushed myself up, my chest heaving with the effort it took just to sit upright. The air in our home was already stifling. It was the middle of July, and without the air conditioning running, the indoor temperature had to be hovering around 90 degrees. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and tried to stand. The room tilted dangerously, but I grabbed the edge of the dresser to steady myself. I slapped my hand against the bedroom light switch. Nothing happened. No reassuring click, no flood of light, just dead silence. A terrifying realization washed over me. I stumbled out of the bedroom and into the adjoining master bathroom, clinging to the walls for support. I reached the sink and pushed the silver handle upward, praying for the familiar rush of cold water to soothe my parched, burning throat. A pathetic, hollow wheeze echoed from the pipes, followed by a single drop of water that landed on the dry porcelain. Bone dry. Derek had actually gone down to the basement and shut off the main water valve. He knew my fever required constant hydration. He knew my medication required water to swallow. He had meticulously removed every basic necessity required to keep me alive. I slid down the bathroom cabinet, resting my hot cheek against the cool tile floor as memories from the previous night rushed back. The argument had started in the hallway, just outside our bedroom. I was coughing uncontrollably, begging Derek to drive me to the emergency room because my chest felt incredibly tight. Instead of helping me, he had stepped back with a look of utter disgust. His mother Barbara and his sister Ashley had been standing right behind him holding their noses, as if my illness was a personal insult to their luxury lifestyle. "She is always playing the victim when it is time for us to bond," Barbara had sneered, her perfectly manicured fingers adjusting her expensive silk scarf. "It is manipulative Derek, She is just jealous that we are spending the summer in Monaco and she has to stay behind and work. Ashley had chimed in, rolling her eyes and checking her reflection in the hall mirror. Seriously, it is just a cold. Drink some tea and stop trying to ruin our family time. I had looked at Derek, pleading with him silently, hoping the man I married would finally stand up to his arrogant mother and entitled sister. Instead, he had turned his back on me. He walked into his dressing room and calmly continued packing his designer luggage, carefully folding his custom suits, while I struggled to breathe in the doorway. "I am not missing my flight because you refuse to take care of yourself," he had said coldly, without even looking in my direction. When I warned him that the doctor said my condition could turn critical within 48 hours without proper care, he simply zipped his suitcase shut and walked past me. The utter lack of empathy in his eyes had broken my heart. But waking up to find he had actively sealed me inside a suffocating trap was something far more sinister than neglect. I slowly forced my exhausted body to rise to my feet, my breathing becoming more ragged and shallow by the very second as I struggled. I desperately needed to find a way to call an ambulance immediately. I staggered back into the bedroom and frantically searched the tangled bedsheets for my cell phone. I checked the floor, the nightstand, and the pockets of my discarded sweater. It was nowhere to be found. A sickening wave of dread crashed over me as I realized Derek had taken my phone with him. He had deliberately stripped away my only lifeline to the outside world. I was completely cut off, locked in a digital fortress, controlled entirely by the remote smartphone access of my husband. The smart locks on the doors were engaged, the deadbolts secured from the outside. Even if I tried to break a window, the reinforced security glass would hold firm. He had planned this perfectly. My vision began to blur at the edges as my oxygen levels steadily dropped. The oppressive heat in the room was closing in on me, making every breath feel like inhaling fire. I slumped against the wall of my walk-in closet, feeling my strength rapidly slipping away. But as my heavy head fell back against the wooden shelving, my eyes locked onto the far, dark corner of the closet floor. Right there, safely hidden beneath a heavy vintage storage trunk, was a slightly elevated loose wooden floorboard. The exact floorboard that concealed my hidden floor safe. Derek thought he had married a simple corporate number cruncher, bringing home a decent paycheck to fund his lavish lifestyle. He had no idea that my actual title was Senior Forensic Accountant for one of the most ruthless asset liquidation firms in the entire country. I spent my days tracking down hidden millions for high-stakes corporate clients, uncovering the exact types of financial deception that arrogant men like my husband thought they were so clever at hiding. Because of the highly classified nature of my audits, I always kept a failsafe at home. I just never imagined I would need to use it to save my own life. I dragged my burning body across the closet floor, my breath rattling with every agonizing inch. The vintage storage trunk was incredibly heavy, but sheer desperation gave me a sudden surge of adrenaline. I pushed my shoulder against the leather side, gritting my teeth as pain ripped through my infected lungs. Slowly, the trunk slid across the floor, revealing the slightly raised oak board beneath it. My fingernails dug into the gap, prying the wood upward until it popped loose. Inside the fireproof compartment rested a sleek black case. I pulled it out with trembling hands and quickly flipped the metal latches open. Inside sat my secure, battery-powered work laptop and a military-grade satellite hotspot my firm required for off-grid communications. Derek had severed my connection to the cell towers and internet provider, but he could not block a satellite sitting in low Earth orbit. My vision swam with dark spots as I fumbled with the power buttons. The green light of the satellite hotspot blinked to life, searching for a signal through the roof. It felt like an eternity passed as I sat slumped against the wall, the 90-degree heat pressing down on me like a physical weight. Sweat dripped into my eyes, blurring the screen as the laptop finally booted up. My hands shook so violently that I could barely type my long encrypted password. Every shallow breath I took sounded like crumpled paper, and my chest felt as though it was wrapped in tight iron bands, tightening with each passing second. I opened my secure messaging portal and immediately selected the contact for Donovan. Donovan was not just a trusted colleague, he was my firm's asset protection attorney. He was a ruthless, fiercely loyal man who navigated corporate warfare with a cold precision that terrified our opponents. More importantly, he was the only person who knew the full extent of my private financial safety net. I typed the message with clumsy, frantic fingers. Derek took my medication and phone, cut power and water. Smart locks engaged. Trapped in the house. Pneumonia critical. I am suffocating. Send private medical transport now. Breach the back glass door. I hit send and watched the small loading circle spin. For a terrifying moment, the screen froze and I thought the connection had dropped. Then the status changed to delivered. Less than 10 seconds later, the typing indicator appeared on Donovan's end. His response was immediate and chillingly precise. Transport dispatched. ETA 8 minutes. Stay low to the ground to preserve oxygen. I will handle the locks. I let out a dry, rasping sob of relief and closed the laptop, hugging it tightly to my chest. The weight was excruciating. The stifling heat in the closet became unbearable, making my skin feel as though it was actively burning. I tried to follow Donovan's instructions, sliding down until I was lying flat against the carpet. I closed my eyes, focusing entirely on drawing whatever thin strands of air I could pull into my failing lungs. The silence of the dead house was deafening, broken only by the horrific wheezing of my own breath. I started to feel a strange floating sensation, a clear sign that my brain was being severely starved of oxygen. The edges of my consciousness began to fray, and darkness crept into the corners of my vision. Suddenly, a loud, shattering crash echoed from the first floor. The sound of breaking glass was followed immediately by heavy, rapid footsteps pounding across the hardwood floors. Voices shouted commands, cutting through the oppressive silence. I tried to call out to let them know I was upstairs in the master closet, but my voice was completely gone. Only a faint, pathetic croak escaped my dry lips. But they did not need to hear me. Donovan had given them the exact layout of the house. The bedroom door was kicked open with tremendous force, and heavy footsteps rushed into the room. A bright flashlight beam swept across the darkness, piercing the shadows of the closet. Someone shouted that they had found me. A paramedic dropped to his knees beside me, his hands moving with urgent, practiced efficiency. He placed a clear plastic oxygen mask over my nose and mouth. The sudden rush of pure, cool oxygen hitting my starved lungs was the most beautiful sensation I had ever experienced. I gasped, pulling the life-saving air deep into my chest. The paramedic lifted me onto a portable stretcher, his voice remaining calm as he told me I was safe now. As they carried me out of the suffocating heat of the house and into the blinding midday sun, the overwhelming exhaustion finally claimed me. The world faded away, and I slipped completely into darkness. I do not know how much time passed before I slowly opened my eyes again. The blinding sunlight had been replaced by the soft, warm glow of recessed lighting. The oppressive heat was gone, replaced by the crisp, clean air conditioning of a hospital room. As my eyes focused, I realized I was not in a standard crowded emergency ward. I was lying in a spacious, luxurious bed in a private VIP medical suite. Fresh flowers sat on a glass table, and a large flat-screen television was mounted on the pristine white wall. The gentle hum of an intravenous drip next to my bed was the only sound in the room. This was the kind of premier medical care that was paid for by my hidden corporate trust, a safety net Derek had no idea existed. I turned my head and saw Donovan by the window. He walked over, holding my secure laptop. "You gave us quite a scare, Jasmine," he said, his voice serious. "The doctor said another hour in that house, without water or medication, and your organs would have shut down." I touched the oxygen cannula. "I am alive," I whispered. "Thank you, Donovan." He set the laptop on my tray table. "You are safe now. The trust covered the entire floor, and we have private security outside. Derek cannot reach you." I leaned back, feeling profound relief. I survived his cruel attempt to let me wither away. I was ready to serve him divorce papers the moment he landed. But Donovan did not smile. His jaw tightened and he leaned closer. "I had our tech team run a full diagnostic on the smart home logs while you were unconscious," Donovan said quietly. "I assume Derek just locked the doors and cut the utilities to make you suffer." He paused, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. "What did you find?" I asked, gripping the blanket. "Derek did not just lock the doors and cut the water," Donovan replied. "He manually disabled the carbon monoxide detectors before he left the property." The words hung in the sterile air of the hospital room, heavy and suffocating. A cold numbness washed over me, starting from my chest and spreading all the way down to my fingertips. He did not just leave me to suffer through a severe fever. He had actively orchestrated a scenario where if the heat or the lack of water did not kill me, a slow, silent gas leak would. He had built a coffin around me and walked away without a single backward glance. Donovan stood silently by the window, allowing me the time to fully process the magnitude of what my husband had done. This was no longer a case of marital neglect or gross incompetence. This was calculated attempted murder. I closed my eyes, taking a long, shuddering breath of the cool, purified hospital air. The raw pain in my lungs was a stark reminder of how close Derek had come to succeeding. "I need my laptop," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the violent trembling in my hands. Donovan hesitated, glancing at the medical monitors tracking my heart rate. "Jasmine, the doctor said you need strict bed rest. Your body has been through extreme trauma. You should sleep." "I cannot sleep until I know exactly what he is doing," I replied, sitting up slightly and wincing against the sharp ache in my ribs. "Derek thinks I am dead or dying in that house right now. He is operating under the assumption that his tracks are covered. I need to see his digital footprint before he realizes his plan failed." Donovan understood the ruthless logic of my profession. He stepped forward and placed the heavy black laptop securely on my tray table, adjusting the screen so I could see it clearly from my pillows. He stepped out into the hallway to speak with the private security detail, leaving me alone with the machine that served as my ultimate weapon. I opened the laptop and immediately launched a suite of specialized forensic auditing programs. Over the past 4 years of marriage, I had intentionally kept my personal finances completely isolated from Derek, but I had also quietly mapped out the architecture of his digital life. I knew his passwords, his preferred security questions, and his blind spots. Within 10 minutes, I had bypassed his two-factor authentication and gained full access to his primary email servers and personal cloud storage. I started by pulling his recent sent emails and financial applications. My eyes scanned through mundane flight confirmations and hotel bookings for their European tour. But then, a specific encrypted document caught my attention. It was a finalized contract from a major national life insurance provider, dated just 4 days before he packed his bags. I opened the file and my stomach dropped. It was a comprehensive policy upgrade on my life. Derek had meticulously forged my digital signature on the authorization forms, maximizing the payout. If I died under accidental or natural circumstances, the policy would pay out $3 million directly to him as the sole beneficiary. The sheer level of premeditation made me feel physically sick. The timeline aligned with terrifying precision. He had secured the $3 million policy, waited precisely 4 days, and then locked me in a 90-degree house with no water, no phone, and disabled carbon monoxide detectors. He was absolutely banking on returning to America as a wealthy, grieving widower. He would have played the part perfectly, sobbing at my funeral, while secretly planning how to spend my life insurance payout. A fresh wave of anger burned through the lingering fog of my illness. It was a clean, sharp fury that cleared my mind completely. I minimized the insurance documents and opened the family-shared cloud drive. Derek had set up a shared photo album for the trip so his mother and sister could instantly upload their vacation pictures. I watched the screen as the folder updated in real time. A new batch of high-resolution photos populated the screen. They were in Monaco. I clicked on a picture of Ashley lounging on the sun deck of a massive private yacht. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair. The next photo showed Derek and his mother Barbara sitting at a lavish waterfront dining table, covered in expensive seafood and imported wine. Derek looked relaxed and tanned, smiling broadly for the camera, without a single trace of guilt or concern on his face. I clicked on Ashley's linked social media profile to view the public posts. She had just uploaded the yacht photo to her feed. I stared at the caption she had typed out just moments ago. Living our best lives. Some people are just too weak to handle the European summer. The sheer audacity of her words made a bitter laugh escape my raw throat. They genuinely believed I was at home sweating through a pathetic cold too fragile to join their elite lifestyle. They had no idea that their luxurious European summer was being funded by a man who had just attempted to murder me for an insurance payout. Barbara had probably encouraged him to take the trip, telling him he deserved a break from dealing with his sickly wife. Ashley simply cared about the free yacht rides and the status symbols she could post online. They were a family of parasites, feeding off an illusion of wealth. I was about to close the browser and call Donovan back into the room when a high-pitched chime echoed from my laptop speakers. It was a specialized alert from my forensic tracking software. When I initiated the hack into Derek's accounts, I had set up an automated trigger to notify me of any large-scale financial movements tied to his Social Security number. I quickly opened the alert dashboard. A massive wire transfer was currently pending clearance. The amount was staggering. It was a single transaction for $450,000 being routed through a complex web of international banks before ultimately landing in a newly established offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing as I traced the origin of the funds. Derek did not have $450,000. Our joint checking account held less than $10,000, and his personal savings were consistently depleted by his expensive car leases and designer clothes. He lived paycheck to paycheck, projecting an image of success while secretly drowning in credit card debt. I ran a rapid, deep-dive trace on the routing numbers, stripping away the dummy accounts and shell corporations he had used to mask the origin point. The software decoded the digital trail, revealing the true source of the money. My breath caught in my throat. The funds were not coming from a hidden savings account or a secret personal loan. The routing number belonged to the primary corporate holding account of his employer. Derek was a senior investment broker at a prestigious wealth management firm in downtown Chicago. He had direct access to millions of dollars in client portfolios. He was not just an attempted murderer trying to cash in on my life insurance policy. He was actively stealing from his own high-profile clients to fund his lavish European vacation and secure his own personal wealth. He was silently draining funds from a source far more dangerous than anything I could have imagined. I froze the pending transfer before it could clear, but I did not touch the destination account. A premature seizure would warn Derek that someone had found him. Instead, I duplicated the transaction inside an isolated forensic environment and began rebuilding its path one layer at a time. The first shell company was registered as a technology consultant in Delaware. The second claimed to provide risk analysis from Nevada. A third existed only as a rented mailbox in Florida. Each company submitted invoices just below Derek's internal approval threshold, allowing him to authorize payments without a second executive signature. The pattern was too disciplined to be a single, desperate theft. I expanded the search window from 30 days to 3 years. The screen filled with identical round-number transfers altered by small amounts to avoid automated detection. One invoice charged his firm for a non-existent market report. Another billed for client retention services that had never been performed. Several payments were routed through a travel management company that shared an address with Ashley's luxury apartment. Derek had hidden the same crime behind different labels, but the timing exposed him. Every transfer occurred within hours of a personal purchase, a car lease, a country club assessment, Barbara's jewelry bill, or a deposit on the European tour. I pulled the underlying client ledgers and felt my anger sharpen into something colder. The money had not come from one wealthy investor who might absorb the loss. Derek had skimmed from retirement accounts, family trusts, and conservative portfolios managed for elderly clients. He stole in small pieces, so no single statement would immediately look catastrophic. A widow in Wisconsin had lost $40,000 from the account that paid her medical expenses. A retired teacher had been charged for a fictitious advisory service every month for nearly a year. Derek had financed champagne in Monaco by quietly cutting holes in other people's futures. My software identified a second layer of concealment. After the vendor payments cleared, portions were transferred into accounts held by Barbara and Ashley. The descriptions were deliberately ordinary family reimbursement, consulting advance household expense. Ashley received enough to make the down payment on her white sports car. Barbara received recurring deposits that matched her country club dues and the payments on her designer jewelry. Whether they understood the original source or simply refused to ask questions would be determined later. What mattered now was that the stolen money could be traced directly into their hands. I created a timeline that connected each fraudulent invoice to the approval credentials used, the receiving account, the subsequent personal purchase, and the device from which Derek authorized the transfer. His office computer, his home tablet, and his phone all carried the same digital signature. Even the Cayman account was not as invisible as he believed. The bank required a beneficial owner declaration, and Derek had uploaded a scan of his passport while sitting on our home network. The metadata preserved the date, location, and device identification. He had signed his own confession without realizing it. Donovan returned while I was exporting the timeline. He studied the first page, then the next, his expression growing harder with every line. I told him not to contact Derek's firm yet. First, we needed immutable copies held outside my control, so no defense attorney could claim I had altered the records during a marital dispute. Donovan called our firm's evidence custodian and arranged a secure transfer. 2 independent forensic analysts verified the hashes of every file, while I recorded a screen capture showing the original locations from which each document had been collected. Only after the evidence chain was complete did I begin the counterstrike. I downloaded every fraudulent ledger, falsified vendor invoice, offshore routing instruction, and internal approval record. I organized them by date and client, then built a concise index that allowed an investigator to move from a stolen dollar to the person who received it in seconds. This was no emotional accusation from an angry wife. It was a professional reconstruction of a criminal enterprise, supported by records Derek believed no one would ever connect. He had been embezzling millions from his own high-profile investment firm for months, slowly draining the accounts of people who trusted him with their life savings. The sheer audacity of his crimes made a bitter laugh escape my raw throat. Derek was sitting on a private yacht in Monaco, drinking expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire financial house of cards was currently displayed on my illuminated screen. A normal person would have picked up the phone and called the police immediately, but I was not a normal person. I was a senior forensic accountant, and I knew that calling the authorities right now would only trigger a messy, prolonged investigation that might give his high-priced defense lawyers time to scramble and hide assets. I did not just want Derek arrested. I wanted his entire life completely and utterly dismantled. Instead of making a phone call, I went to work. I meticulously downloaded every single fraudulent ledger, every falsified vendor invoice, and every encrypted offshore routing number. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing internal firewalls and extracting years of financial records that proved exactly how and when Derek had stolen the client funds. I compiled an ironclad, comprehensive dossier of his corporate theft, documenting every stolen dollar with undeniable cryptographic proof. Once the digital dossier was complete, I uploaded the massive file to an anonymous encrypted server. I then set up a sophisticated deadman switch programmed to deliver the files directly to the Corporate Federal Compliance Board and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The automated delivery system was locked and armed, ready to deploy the catastrophic financial evidence the moment I authorized the release. Derek had built an illusion of wealth on a foundation of massive federal crimes, and I was currently holding the detonator. I closed the terminal window and leaned back against the hospital pillows, my chest rising and falling with a calm, measured rhythm. The burning pain in my lungs had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I had secured the evidence needed to ensure that my husband would spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. The financial destruction of his career was permanently sealed. Just as I finished encrypting the final backup drive, the heavy oak door of my hospital suite swung open. Donovan walked into the room, carrying a thick manila folder under his arm. His crisp, tailored suit rustled as he approached the side of my bed, his expression shifting from professional concern to sharp anticipation. He looked down at the glowing screen of my laptop and then met my eyes, fully aware of the digital warfare I had just executed from my hospital bed. He opened the manila folder and pulled out pristine legal documents. I recognized the heavy embossed paper. They were the original property deeds for our suburban home. "Derek thinks he trapped you in his home," Donovan said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous register as he laid the documents across my tray table. "Should we remind him who owns the limited liability company that bought the property?" I looked down at the property deeds bearing my private corporate seal. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. "Yes," I quietly whispered. "The retaliation is just about to begin." The property deeds on my tray table changed the nature of the fight. Derek had always spoken about the house as if it were proof of his success. He chose the furniture, bragged about the neighborhood, and introduced himself to contractors as the owner. In reality, I had purchased the property 18 months before our wedding through a private limited liability company created for asset protection. Derek had never contributed to the down payment, the mortgage, the taxes, or a major repair. His name appeared on none of the ownership documents. Donovan did not promise me an effortless victory. He explained every step that had to be completed before the house could be sold without creating an opening for Derek to challenge the transaction. We obtained a formal title report, confirmed the LLC remained solely under my control, documented that no marital funds had been used to acquire the property, and preserved records showing that the household expenses Derek occasionally paid were ordinary living costs rather than ownership contributions. The goal was not speed alone. The goal was a sale that would survive any attack his attorneys attempted later. A cash buyer, represented by a reputable local firm, had already expressed interest in the neighborhood. Donovan contacted the buyer's attorney without revealing my medical condition or the criminal investigation. Within 24 hours, we received a serious offer supported by proof of funds. I authorized an independent valuation so Derek could never claim I had deliberately sold the house below market value to deprive him of marital property. The offer was slightly above the valuation and required no financing contingency. I accepted it from my hospital bed. While the title company prepared the closing documents, Donovan filed my petition for divorce. The filing cited financial fraud, physical endangerment, and the deliberate deprivation of medication and emergency assistance. We attached a photograph of Derek's handwritten note, the smart home logs, the hospital report, and the preliminary evidence showing the forged life insurance authorization. The judge granted a temporary protective order and prohibited Derek from entering any property I occupied or contacting me outside counsel. The next problem was money. Several credit cards carried my name as the primary account holder, even though Derek treated them as his personal treasury. I could not simply empty joint accounts or seize funds that might later be disputed. Instead, Donovan obtained narrowly tailored orders, allowing the institutions to freeze credit lines tied to my identity and preserve the balances pending the divorce. My separate trust accounts were moved behind new authentication protocols. Passwords were changed, access tokens revoked, and every device Derek had ever used was removed from my financial profiles. I also resigned as guarantor on 2 luxury accounts Derek had opened using my credit history. The issuers reviewed the fraud evidence and suspended the cards rather than transferring the debt to me. I instructed my accountant to maintain a complete ledger of every protective action. If Derek accused me of sabotage, we would be able to show that I had not taken his property. I had only stopped him from using mine. The sale closed 3 days later. The funds moved directly into the LLC's protected account. I signed through a verified remote notary session while 2 witnesses observed from the hospital conference room. The title company recorded the transfer, and the buyer received possession on a date chosen to give a licensed moving company enough time to clear the property. Derek's belongings were handled with more care than he had shown me. Donovan hired a bonded inventory service. Every suit, shoe, watch box, photograph, and personal document was cataloged and filmed before being packed. Items that indisputably belonged to Barbara or Ashley were separated and labeled. Nothing was destroyed, nothing was hidden. Everything was delivered to a secure storage facility on the south side with 1 month of rent prepaid and written instructions for collection through counsel. I kept only what belonged to me: my professional records, family photographs, clothing, and the few personal objects I had brought into the marriage. The medicine Derek had hidden was found inside a locked suitcase in his dressing room. The inhaler lay beneath his folded shirts, and the antibiotic bottle was sealed inside a toiletry bag. The inventory supervisor photographed both items where they were discovered before placing them in an evidence container. That discovery removed the last possibility that Derek could claim he had moved the medicine by accident. The insurer received a preservation notice before Derek could cancel or alter the policy. Its fraud unit suspended the coverage, retained the original application data, and confirmed that no payout could be made while the forged authorization was under investigation. Donovan also notified the utility companies and smart home provider that their records were subject to legal hold. Meter data access logs, customer service calls, and remote commands were copied into protected storage. Every part of Derek's plan now existed outside his control. I arranged for a security company to inspect the penthouse before I arrived. They installed an independent access system, removed all default credentials, and created a direct emergency channel that did not depend on a household internet connection. The precautions were not signs of fear. They were proof that I would never again confuse trust with surrendering control. My medical team approved the move only after Donovan confirmed that nurses could enter at any hour and that oxygen equipment would remain available until my lungs fully recovered. The closing also forced one final financial truth into view. After the mortgage and transaction costs were paid, the remaining proceeds were substantial because I had built equity long before Derek entered my life. He had spent years presenting the property as the crown jewel of his status, yet the sale record showed that his contribution to its value was zero. I placed the proceeds in the LLC account and instructed the trustee not to use a single dollar for retaliation. The money would fund my recovery, legal protection, and whatever future I chose after the divorce. Before authorizing the movers, I sent the buyer a written disclosure explaining that an estranged spouse might appear after closing and claim the house. The buyer's attorney reviewed the title history and accepted the risk because the ownership record was clear. Local police received a copy of the recorded deed and the protective order not as part of a spectacle, but so the new family would not be left defenseless if Derek returned angry. Every person affected by my counterstrike was protected before I moved to the next step. By the time I left the hospital from my temporary penthouse, the suburban house no longer belonged to me. Derek's access to my money had been severed, and the divorce petition was waiting to be served. I did not celebrate. I stood beside the penthouse window, breathing carefully through lungs that were still healing, and watched the city lights appear one by one. Somewhere in Europe, Derek believed I was trapped in darkness and dependent on him. He did not know the house was sold, his possessions were in storage, or the accounts built on my credit had been frozen. On the 18th day of his trip, the financial institutions completed the last protective holds. At nearly the same moment, the compliance package reached the investigators reviewing his firm. Derek sat down for an extravagant dinner in Paris, believing he still controlled everything. The first time he handed a waiter his platinum card, the illusion began to collapse. It was day 18 of their trip. Across the Atlantic, in the heart of Paris, Derek was preparing to host what he thought would be the crowning dinner of their luxurious getaway. Through Ashley's social media updates, I could see the exact Michelin-starred restaurant they had chosen. The dining room boasted a spectacular view of the Eiffel Tower, dripping with crystal chandeliers and velvet upholstery. They ordered imported caviar truffles and vintage champagne, celebrating a lifestyle built entirely on my stolen money and a dead woman's insurance policy. Derek sat at the head of the table, dressed in a bespoke linen suit, basking in the glow of his mother's endless praise. Barbara was raising her glass, toasting to her son's brilliant success, while making snide remarks about how I was missing out on the trip of a lifetime. Ashley was busy adjusting the lighting on her smartphone, recording every lavish detail to make her friends jealous back in Chicago. They were sitting on top of the world, completely blind to the fact that I had pulled the financial rug out from under them. The evening was wrapping up, and the impeccably dressed waiter approached their table carrying a silver tray with a leather-bound checkbook. Derek gave his mother a confident smile, waving away her attempt to reach for her purse. He pulled out his platinum card and dropped it onto the tray with an arrogant flick of his wrist. The waiter gave a polite bow and retreated toward the point-of-sale terminal. Derek leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, savoring the illusion of his immense wealth. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Derek glanced toward the back of the restaurant, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. Finally, the waiter returned, but his demeanor had changed. The deferential smile was gone, replaced by a tight grimace. He leaned down and spoke softly so the neighboring tables would not hear. "I apologize, monsieur, but your card has been declined." Derek let out a short, dismissive laugh, completely unbothered. He assumed it was a simple fraud alert triggered by international travel. He assured the waiter it was just a bank error and pulled a second premium credit card from his wallet. He handed it over, telling the waiter to run it and keep the change. Barbara sighed, complaining about European banking systems, while Ashley continued taking selfies, oblivious to the impending disaster. The waiter returned 2 minutes later. This time he did not bother to hide his impatience. He placed the second card on the table. "Declined again, monsieur. The bank indicates the account is frozen. Do you have another form of payment?" A flush of embarrassment crept up Derek's neck. He could feel the eyes of the wealthy patrons at adjacent tables lingering on their interaction. The illusion of the high-rolling American millionaire was beginning to crack. He muttered an apology to his mother, forcing a smile, as he dug into his wallet for his third and final card. This one was tied directly to his personal checking account. He handed it to the waiter, his hand trembling slightly. When the waiter returned for the third time, he brought the restaurant manager with him. The manager stared down at Derek with cold, professional disdain. "Monsieur, all of your accounts are reporting as locked by the issuing institutions. You must provide a valid form of payment immediately, or we will contact the local authorities." Barbara gasped, clutching her pearl necklace in absolute horror. "Derek, you need to fix this right now," she hissed, her voice shrill with panic. "People are staring at us!" Derek was sweating profusely now. The expensive linen suit suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket. The confidence had completely drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, terrified expression. He stammered a frantic apology to the manager, asking for a few minutes to contact his bank and resolve the misunderstanding. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly, and sprinted toward the private restrooms at the back of the restaurant. He locked himself inside a marble-tiled bathroom stall, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He pulled out his phone and opened his primary banking application. The screen loaded, and his stomach dropped. A stark red banner stretched across the interface. "Account frozen. Please contact the fraud department immediately." He swiped to his secondary accounts. Locked. He checked his joint accounts tied to my name. Access denied. I had systematically severed his access to every single dollar he thought he controlled. Panic clawed at his throat. He leaned against the cool marble wall, trying to steady his racing heart. This had to be a mistake. Maybe I had forgotten to pay a bill. Maybe the bank suspected identity theft. But deep down, a terrifying realization was beginning to form. He needed cash, and he needed it right now to pay the massive restaurant bill and avoid a humiliating arrest in a foreign country. He opened his secure browser, navigating to the hidden portal for the offshore accounts he had set up in the Cayman Islands. These were the accounts holding the millions he had embezzled from his wealthy corporate clients. He typed in his credentials, his fingers slipping on the glass screen from the sweat pouring down his palms. This money was his ultimate safety net. It was completely untraceable. He hit the login button and held his breath waiting for the sight of his massive stolen balance. The screen flashed white. The dashboard did not load. Instead, a terrifying error code appeared in bold black text across the center of his phone. Assets seized, pending federal inquiry. Derek dropped his phone. It clattered against the tile floor, the screen cracking under the impact. He stared at the shattered device, his mind unable to process the words he had just read. Seized. Federal inquiry. It was not a bank error. It was not a fraud alert. His financial life had been dismantled, and the authorities knew exactly what he had done. He fell to his knees in the cramped bathroom stall, gripping his hair as the walls began to close in around him. He snatched the broken phone off the floor, ignoring the shards of glass biting into his thumb. He had to call his office. He had to reach his managing director in Chicago and figure out how much the compliance board knew. He scrolled through his contacts and dialed the emergency executive hotline for his firm. The line rang twice before clicking over. Derek held the phone to his ear, desperately expecting to hear the familiar voice of the night shift receptionist. Instead, a cold, automated, recorded message played through the speaker. You have reached the Human Resources Legal Department. If you are calling regarding the termination of Derek, the system paused, inserting his full legal name before continuing. Please be advised that this individual has been terminated with cause. Federal authorities have been notified of the ongoing internal investigation, and all communications must be routed through our external legal counsel. The automated voice clicked off, leaving nothing but a dead dial tone echoing in his ear. The dead dial tone buzzed against Derek's ear like a physical blow. He slowly lowered the phone, staring at the shattered screen in absolute disbelief. Terminated with cause. Federal authorities notified. The words repeated in his mind, forming a suffocating loop of terror. He stumbled back against the marble wall of the bathroom stall, his chest heaving as he tried to draw oxygen into his tightening lungs. The pristine facade he had spent years meticulously building had just been incinerated in a matter of hours. Desperation quickly morphed into a frantic, misplaced rage. He opened his email application, his thumbs slipping over the cracked glass as he hammered out a message to my personal address. He still firmly believed I was trapped in the sweltering suburban house, completely dependent on his mercy. He typed furiously, assuming I had somehow figured out a way to mess with the joint accounts to punish him. "Turn the cards back on right now," he demanded in the subject line. The body of the email was a chaotic mess of threats and justifications. "Stop playing these pathetic games, Jasmine. I know you are upset about the trip, but freezing my accounts is illegal. Fix this immediately or I am extending the vacation and leaving you to sweat it out even longer. Do not push me." He hit send and immediately started typing another one demanding I wire funds for my private savings. He sent 4 emails in the span of 3 minutes, each one growing more aggressive and unhinged than the last. Thousands of miles away, I sat, perfectly comfortable, on the plush velvet sofa of my new luxury penthouse. The expansive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the illuminated Chicago skyline. The central air conditioning hummed a soft, steady rhythm, maintaining a flawless 70 degrees. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my chamomile tea, letting the warm, soothing liquid ease the lingering rawness in my throat. My secure laptop rested on the glass coffee table in front of me, softly chiming as Derek's frantic emails flooded into my inbox. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety as I read his pathetic threats. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. I watched the bold subject lines appear on the screen, dictating that I stop playing games and submit to his authority. He was still operating under the delusion that he held all the cards. With a calm, steady hand, I highlighted the entire block of incoming messages. I did not reply. I did not even open them to read the full text. I simply created a new automated inbox rule, routing every single message from his email address directly into a designated legal evidence junk folder before marking them as read. The silence in my penthouse remained unbroken, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew he was currently enduring. Back in Paris, the reality of the situation was crashing down on Derek with brutal force. He could not hide in the bathroom stall forever. The restaurant manager was waiting, and the bill for the extravagant Michelin-starred dinner still needed to be settled. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, splashed water on his pale face, and forced himself to walk back out into the elegant dining room. Barbara and Ashley looked up expectantly as he approached the table. The restaurant manager stood rigidly beside them, his arms crossed over his chest. "Well," Derek, Barbara asked, her voice laced with impatience, "did you sort out the bank error? People are beginning to stare, and it is completely unacceptable." Derek swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He looked at the manager and then down at his own wrist. He unclasped the heavy silver band of his custom Rolex watch. It was a vintage timepiece he had purchased with a massive bonus 2 years ago, a symbol of his elite status. He placed the heavy watch onto the silver payment tray, pushing it slowly across the white tablecloth toward the manager. "My bank has temporarily locked the accounts due to an international security flag," he lied, his voice shaking as he spoke. "This watch is worth more than triple the cost of the meal. Keep it as collateral. I will return tomorrow morning with the cash to retrieve it." The manager picked up the watch, examining it with a critical eye before giving a stiff, curt nod. He accepted the collateral, but made it abundantly clear that they were no longer welcome in the establishment. Barbara sat in stunned, horrified silence as the waiter quickly cleared their half-empty champagne glasses. Ashley lowered her phone, her mouth dropping open in utter disbelief. They were unceremoniously ushered out of the dining room, the whispers and judging stares of the other wealthy patrons burning into their backs. As soon as they hit the cool night air of the Parisian street, Ashley turned on her brother. "What is going on, Derek?" she demanded, stamping her foot on the cobblestone. "We have the private yacht rental scheduled for tomorrow morning. I already posted about it online. You better not tell me that is canceled too." Derek ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Everything is canceled, Ashley. We need to get back to the hotel right now and figure out how to access emergency funds. I cannot get into any of the accounts." The taxi ride back to their 5-star hotel was suffocatingly tense. Barbara berated Derek the entire way, demanding to know how he could be so careless with his travel notifications. Derek sat in miserable silence, entirely unable to confess that he was actually facing federal embezzlement charges and total financial ruin. He just needed to get back to the suite, connect to the secure hotel internet, and figure out a way to borrow money. But the humiliation was far from over. When they marched into the grand lobby of their luxury hotel, they went straight to the elevators. Derek swiped his keycard over the sensor to access the penthouse floor. The elevator panel blinked an angry red light. Access denied. He tried again. The red light flashed a second time. The front desk manager immediately stepped out from behind the concierge counter, flanked by 2 burly hotel security guards. "Mr. Davis," the manager said, his voice projecting across the quiet marble lobby. "The credit card you placed on file for the daily incidental hold has been declined by your bank. Per hotel policy, we attempted to run the authorization twice, and both attempts resulted in a hard freeze from the issuing institution. We can no longer accommodate your stay." Derek stared at the manager, his face draining of all remaining color. "You are evicting us. It is the middle of the night. You cannot just throw us out onto the street." "You have 30 minutes to pack your belongings and vacate the premises," the manager replied, pointing toward the service elevator. "The security personnel will escort you to your room to ensure nothing is removed from the minibar. If you do not leave willingly, we will contact the Parisian police." Barbara let out a high-pitched gasp of absolute indignation. She had never been treated with such disrespect in her entire life. They were herded into the service elevator by the silent security guards, completely stripped of their dignity. Within 30 minutes, they were standing on the dark Parisian sidewalk, surrounded by their matching designer luggage, with absolutely nowhere to go. The reality of their sudden homelessness finally shattered Barbara's fragile composure. She paced the sidewalk, her face twisted in a mask of pure, venomous rage. "This is her fault!" she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at Derek. "I told you that useless wife of yours was a liability. She probably forgot to deposit her paycheck and caused a cascade failure on the joint accounts." Barbara snatched her cell phone from her designer handbag. Her fingers aggressively stabbed the screen as she pulled up my old contact number. The phone rang, putting her straight through to the digital voicemail system I had set up earlier that afternoon. She did not even pause to take a breath before launching into a furious, unhinged tirade. "You spiteful, useless wife!" Her voice screeched through the speaker, echoing into the quiet European night. "You are ruining our family trip. Derek's cards are declining because of your financial incompetence. We are standing on the street in Paris like common beggars. You fix this immediately. Do you hear me? You call the bank and you fix this right now, or I swear, Derek is leaving you the second we get back to Chicago. You are nothing but a burden to my son." She ended the call breathing heavily and shoved the phone back into her purse, fully believing her aggressive intimidation tactic would frighten me into submission. In my quiet Chicago penthouse, a soft notification pinged on my laptop screen, indicating a new audio file had been captured. I opened the secure portal and pressed play, listening to the screeching, venomous voicemail with absolute pristine clarity. A cold, satisfied smile spread across my face as the recording ended. I moved the mouse and clicked save, dragging the audio file directly into the folder labeled Divorce Proceedings Exhibit A. The perfect piece of evidence was now secured. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing through the quiet luxury of my penthouse. While I drifted into the most peaceful and uninterrupted sleep I had experienced in years, the sun was beginning to rise over the cobblestone streets of Paris, illuminating the ruins of my husband's grand European vacation. Derek, Barbara, and Ashley had spent the remaining hours of the long, miserable night sitting upright on a hard wooden bench in a crowded public train station, guarding their designer luggage from passing strangers. The crisp morning air offered absolutely no comfort to Derek. His mind was racing, cycling repeatedly through the terrifying reality of the automated message from Human Resources. He had not told his mother or his sister about the federal inquiry or his termination. He simply could not bear the crushing humiliation of admitting his massive professional failure. Instead, he maintained the elaborate lie that I had maliciously frozen their joint accounts out of petty jealousy because I was stuck at home. He desperately needed a place for them to sleep, but his financial options were severely limited. Using the last few euros he had exchanged at the airport, Derek managed to secure a single room at a cramped, run-down hostel located on the far industrial outskirts of the city. It was a bleak, depressing building with peeling gray paint and narrow, dimly lit hallways. To get there, the family was forced to navigate the public transit system during the chaotic morning rush hour. This was the exact moment where the remaining shreds of their familial solidarity completely dissolved into bitter resentment. As a crowded city bus pulled up to their stop, Ashley stared at the folding doors in absolute horror. She was wearing expensive silk trousers and holding a pristine white leather handbag, completely unequipped for the realities of public transportation. When Derek told her to grab her massive suitcases, she threw a spectacular screeching tantrum right on the dirty sidewalk. She screamed that she was not a pack mule and demanded that Derek hail a private luxury car immediately. Derek, his patience having entirely evaporated, snapped back that there were no private cars coming, and she could either carry her own bags or leave them sitting on the curb. Ashley sobbed hysterically as she dragged the heavy luggage up the steep steps of the bus. Her carefully curated social media presence went completely dark. Her phone stayed hidden deep in her pocket as she hid her tear-stained face. Barbara was equally furious, though her intense anger was entirely directed at Derek. As they squeezed into the back of the crowded, poorly ventilated bus, she hissed at him in a low, venomous tone that carried over the engine noise. She blamed him for being incredibly weak, for not controlling his wife better, and for allowing a woman to humiliate their prestigious family in a foreign country. She demanded to know why he had not forced me to sign over all my financial rights the very moment we were married. Derek stood gripping the overhead metal rail, sweating profusely in his wrinkled linen suit. He let his mother rant, absorbing her toxic words, while his own internal panic threatened to completely consume him. He was absolutely terrified of the looming federal charges waiting for him back in America. The very thought of government investigators seizing his firm's records and freezing his offshore accounts made his stomach churn with severe nausea. But Derek was a narcissist to his very core. His intense fear quickly morphed into a desperate, twisted sense of bravado. He convinced himself that this was all just a temporary bureaucratic setback. He rationalized that the compliance board must have found a minor discrepancy, something he could easily explain away with forged, backdated invoices once he returned to the office and charmed his superiors. More importantly, he convinced himself that he could still easily dominate me. He vividly pictured himself kicking open the front door of our suburban house, finding me weak and terrified from the sickness, and bullying me into transferring my private savings to cover his tracks. He firmly believed he still held the ultimate power. When they finally arrived at the cheap hostel, the harsh reality of their situation sank in even further. The room was incredibly tiny, smelling faintly of strong bleach and stale cigarette smoke. There was one lumpy twin bed and a set of rusted metal bunk beds pushed against a stained yellow wall. Barbara sat on the edge of the squeaking mattress, refusing to take off her designer shoes, while Ashley curled up on the bottom bunk and cried herself to an exhausted sleep. Derek pulled out his laptop, connecting to the spotty, unreliable wireless internet of the hostel. He desperately needed to verify their return flights to Chicago. He logged into the airline portal, praying that the first-class tickets he had booked months ago were still valid and untouched. A cold sweat broke out across his broad shoulders as the itinerary slowly loaded on the screen. Cancelled. The airline had attempted to process the final upgrade fee using his primary credit card, and when the card returned a hard freeze, the entire reservation had been flagged and completely revoked. They were officially stranded. Derek had absolutely no choice left. He had to swallow his massive pride and beg his relatives for help. He opened his phone contacts and began messaging extended family members back in the United States. People he had deliberately ignored or looked down upon for years because they were not wealthy enough for his taste. He texted his uncle in Ohio and a distant cousin in Denver, feeding them a desperate, fabricated story about a massive banking glitch and a stolen wallet. He begged for an emergency wire transfer, promising to pay them back with generous interest. It took 6 agonizing hours of groveling before his uncle finally agreed to wire a few $1,000s through an international transfer service. Derek rushed out to a local branch to collect the physical cash. He then marched straight to a discount travel agency on the corner. There were no direct flights available, and certainly no premium seats. He was forced to purchase 3 economy-class tickets on a strict budget airline. The itinerary was a grueling, punishing route. It involved a 14-hour journey with 2 lengthy layovers in obscure airports before finally touching down at the airport in Chicago. It was the cheapest, most miserable travel arrangement possible, but it was their only ticket out of the massive nightmare he had created. He returned to the dismal, filthy hostel room and tossed the printed itineraries onto the small plastic table. "Pack your things," he told his mother and sister, his voice tight with exhausted resentment. "We are leaving tonight. We just have to get through this terrible flight. Once we are back in Chicago, I will go straight to the house and force Jasmine to fix this massive disaster. I will make her regret ever touching my accounts." He zipped his designer suitcase, gripping the handle with a renewed, aggressive confidence. He looked around the depressing room, taking a deep breath, truly believing that the absolute worst of his humiliation was finally over. He was completely wrong. The grueling journey back to Chicago was a masterclass in psychological torture and physical degradation. The budget airline Derek had booked out of pure desperation offered 0 amenities. Instead, they found themselves crammed into the very last row of the aircraft, pinned against the rattling wall of the rear lavatory. The seats were stiff, unyielding, and covered in scratchy synthetic fabric. Barbara spent the entire 14 hours complaining bitterly about the lack of legroom. Ashley was entirely unresponsive, having swallowed 2 sleeping pills. She spent the flight slumped uncomfortably against the smudged window. Derek sat rigidly between them, staring blankly at the stained fabric of the seat in front of him. His expensive linen suit was now hopelessly wrinkled, smelling faintly of sour sweat. He felt a constant gnawing ache in the pit of his stomach. Every time the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, his mind flashed to images of federal investigators raiding his office. But as the miles slowly ticked by over the dark Atlantic Ocean, Derek's innate narcissism began to override his profound panic. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to absorb the massive weight of this failure, and I was the perfect, convenient target. He convinced himself that the federal inquiry was likely just an automated flag triggered by my malicious interference with his marital accounts. By the time the wheels finally touched down on the tarmac in Chicago, his fear had fully hardened into a cold, furious resolve. He was going to march directly into his house, rip the laptop out of my hands, and force me to undo every single lock I had initiated. They bypassed the usual luxury car service queue and dragged their scuffed designer suitcases toward the chaotic line for public taxis. The humid summer air of Illinois hit them like a wet, heavy blanket, further ruining their already miserable dispositions. They piled into the back of a worn-smelling cab, sitting in hostile silence, as the driver navigated the busy expressways toward their affluent suburb. Barbara glared out the window, muttering under her breath about how quickly she needed a hot shower and a stiff drink. Ashley scrolled mindlessly through her phone, which was now permanently disconnected from cellular data, running solely on the spotty wireless connection of the moving taxi. Derek simply stared straight ahead, gripping the plastic handle of his briefcase so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. When the taxi finally turned onto their familiar tree-lined street, a false sense of security briefly washed over him. The manicured lawns and stately colonial homes offered a comforting illusion of safety. This was his territory. He belonged here. The taxi pulled up to the wide, paved driveway of our house. Derek paid the driver with the last handful of rumpled bills his uncle had wired him, leaving absolutely no tip. He climbed out of the vehicle and stretched his stiff, aching back. The sweltering midday sun beat down on his shoulders as he pulled his heavy luggage from the trunk. Barbara and Ashley stood on the edge of the pristine sidewalk, looking thoroughly defeated. "Let us just get inside," Barbara snapped, wiping a bead of sweat from her upper lip. "I cannot spend another second in these clothes." Derek grabbed the handles of his two massive suitcases and began trudging up the long, sloping driveway. He was exhausted, humiliated, and thoroughly unbathed, but a dark, twisted anticipation fueled his heavy steps. He imagined me cowering in the living room, terrified of the consequences of my little rebellion. He marched up the brick walkway, entirely focused on the digital keypad mounted beside the heavy oak front door. He dropped his luggage onto the porch, rubbing his sore palms. He stepped up to the smart lock, reaching out to punch in the 6-digit master code he had used 1,000 times before. His thumb pressed the glowing numbers in rapid succession. The digital lock chimed a sharp, discordant tone. A red light flashed across the display panel. Access denied. Derek frowned, shaking his head in annoyance. He assumed his sweaty fingers had simply slipped on the glass interface. He wiped his hand against his wrinkled trousers and carefully typed the numbers again, pressing firmly on each digit. The lock chimed again. The red light flashed brighter. Invalid entry. A spark of genuine confusion pierced through his mounting anger. He tried a third time using the backup code we usually reserved for the cleaning service. The screen flashed red immediately. Invalid entry. Security lockout initiated. Derek took a step back, staring at the dark screen of the keypad. "What is taking so long?" Ashley whined from the bottom of the porch steps, struggling to drag her heavy bag up the incline. "Just open the door, Derek. It is boiling out here." "The code is not working," Derek muttered, his heart rate suddenly spiking. She must have changed the master code from her phone. He stepped up to the large picture window next to the front door, pressing his face against the glass to look inside. He planned to bang on the pane until I came out of the bedroom to face him. But as his eyes adjusted to the shadows inside the house, his breath caught in his throat. The heavy velvet curtains that usually framed the living room windows were gone, replaced by cheap, generic white blinds. He pulled his face away from the glass and looked around the porch, his mind struggling to process the visual information. The expensive teakwood patio furniture he had purchased last summer was completely missing. The large ceramic planters that usually held his mother's prized hydrangeas had vanished. The porch was entirely bare, swept clean of any personal touches. A new, profound panic seized him, replacing the anger with a cold, terrifying confusion. This was not just a changed lock. The house looked completely different. "Open this door, right now!" he screamed, slamming his fist against the solid oak wood. "Jasmine, I know you are in there! Open this door immediately!" He pounded against the frame with all his remaining strength. The heavy thuds echoed down the quiet suburban street, drawing the attention of a neighbor walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk. Barbara rushed up the porch steps, her face pale with alarm. "Derek, stop making a scene," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "People are looking at us." Derek ignored her entirely. He raised his heavy leather shoe and kicked the bottom of the door, leaving a dark scuff mark on the pristine white paint. "You cannot lock me out of my own house!" he roared, his voice cracking with hysterical rage. "I swear to God, Jasmine, if you do not open this door right now, I will break a window." He raised his foot to kick the solid wood again, but he suddenly froze. From the other side of the heavy door came the distinct, mechanical sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The smart lock chimed a pleasant, welcoming tone. The brass handle slowly turned. Derek dropped his foot, a cruel, triumphant smirk instantly returning to his sweating face. He straightened his ruined suit jacket, fully preparing to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse on me the moment the door swung open. The heavy oak door pulled inward, revealing the cool, air-conditioned foyer. But the triumphant smirk vanished from Derek's face instantly, replaced by a look of absolute, uncomprehending horror. It was not his sick, terrified wife standing in the entryway. Instead, a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and holding a solid aluminum baseball bat stood firmly in the doorframe. He looked down at Derek with a mixture of profound confusion and escalating hostility. His thick arms were tense, completely blocking any view of the interior hallway. Derek stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the porch floorboards. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the visual information. He peered past the broad shoulders of the intimidating man, expecting to see the minimalist luxury decor he had painstakingly curated. Instead, he saw a completely alien environment. The sleek marble entryway table was gone, replaced by a rustic wooden bench, covered in scattered, colorful sneakers and small, brightly patterned backpacks. From the kitchen down the hall, the warm scent of cooking bacon and fresh pancakes drifted out into the morning air. A woman in a floral bathrobe stood frozen near the kitchen island, clutching a coffee mug to her chest, while two young children sat on tall bar stools, staring wide-eyed toward the commotion. A completely different family was living inside the house. "Who the hell are you, and why are you kicking my door?" the burly man demanded, his voice a deep, booming rumble that vibrated the floorboards beneath Derek's feet. He adjusted his grip on the aluminum bat, shifting his weight aggressively. Derek swallowed hard, trying to summon his usual arrogant corporate authority, but all that came out was a pathetic, high-pitched stammer. "This is my house," he finally managed to say, pointing a trembling finger at his own chest. "I live here. My wife is Jasmine. She is inside. What are you doing in my house?" The man stared at him, his bushy eyebrows pulling together in a harsh scowl of disbelief. He looked at Derek's wrinkled linen suit and the heavy sweat pouring down his pale face. Then he looked past Derek to the bottom of the porch steps, where Barbara and Ashley stood frozen in absolute terror, surrounded by their designer luggage. The man let out a short, incredulous scoff. "Listen, buddy, I do not know what kind of scam you are trying to pull here, but you need to back away from my door right now," the man said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. This is not your house. I have never heard of you, and I do not know any Jasmine." Derek felt a cold, sickening wave of panic wash over his body. "No, you do not understand," he pleaded, his voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "I am Derek. I own this property. I have lived here for 4 years. You are trespassing. I will call the police." The man let out a booming, harsh laugh, stepping forward onto the porch. He did not look intimidated in the slightest. He looked completely exasperated. He raised his free hand and pointed a thick, calloused finger toward the side of the attached 3-car garage. Derek followed the direction of his pointing finger, his eyes landing on a patch of grass near the bushes. Resting casually against the red brick wall was a large wooden real estate sign. A bright red banner was plastered diagonally across the agency logo, featuring a single devastating word: sold. "I bought this place in a cash sale 2 weeks ago," the new owner stated firmly, his deep voice cutting through the humid air like a physical blade. "We closed the deal in 3 days flat. The previous owner's lawyer hired a moving crew and packed up some guy's stuff into a cheap storage unit on the south side of the city. Now pick up your bags and get off my property before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." The words slammed into Derek's chest with the force of a freight train. He could not breathe. The world around him seemed to tilt violently on its axis. 2 weeks ago, a cash sale. The lawyer packing his belongings into a storage unit. The horrifying realization hit him with absolute brutal clarity, shattering the final remnants of his massive ego. He had never owned this house. The property had been purchased entirely with my private funds prior to our marriage, and the deed was held securely under my personal limited liability company. It was a legally isolated asset that he had absolutely zero claim to in the eyes of the law. I had completely liquidated the property right out from under him while he was busy drinking champagne and pretending to be a millionaire on a yacht in Monaco. I had not just locked him out of the house. I had sold the very ground he was standing on, making him entirely homeless. Down on the pristine sidewalk, Barbara suddenly let out a horrific strangled gasp. She had heard every single word the new owner had said. The absolute reality of their complete financial ruin finally pierced through her thick layers of arrogance and denial. The luxurious lifestyle she had constantly bragged about to her elite social circle, the country club memberships, the expensive dinners, the lavish vacations, it was all a fragile, hollow illusion built entirely on my money. And now that money was gone forever. She clutched her chest, swaying dangerously on her expensive heels. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, escalating into a full-blown, terrifying hyperventilation. She dropped her designer handbag onto the concrete, clutching her throat as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. Ashley screamed, dropping her own luggage and rushing to her mother's side, completely useless in a crisis, but crying hysterically all the same. Derek stood completely paralyzed on the front porch, staring blankly at the solid wooden door that the new owner had just slammed shut directly in his face. The sharp metallic click of the heavy deadbolt sliding into place echoed in his ears, sounding exactly like the final nail being driven into his own coffin. He had absolutely nothing left. No home, no money, no career, no secret offshore accounts. He was a ruined, disgraced man standing on a stranger's porch wearing a dirty suit and facing a lifetime of public humiliation. He slowly turned around, his mind entirely blank, his legs feeling like lead weights as he began to trudge down the porch steps toward his weeping mother and hysterical sister. He needed to figure out a plan. He needed to find a cheap motel room or call another distant relative to beg for a place to crash. He needed to find a way to disappear before the Corporate Compliance Board officially released the findings of their internal investigation to the public. But his time had officially run out. Before he could even process the absolute finality of the house sale, or take a single step toward his frantic, hyperventilating mother, the quiet tranquility of the upscale suburban street was shattered. Two large, unmarked black sport utility vehicles turned onto the street, their engines humming with a deep, powerful intensity. They moved with coordinated, tactical precision, gliding smoothly down the asphalt before pulling aggressively into the wide, paved driveway. They angled their heavy frames to completely block the end of the driveway, trapping the family taxicab and severing any possible route of escape. The vehicles sat in perfect silence, their tinted windows hiding the occupants. Derek stopped dead in his tracks, cold, primal terror gripping his spine as the heavy doors of the vehicles simultaneously began to open. The driver's side door of the first black vehicle swung open. Donovan emerged, looking absolutely impeccable in a charcoal gray tailored suit. He adjusted his silk tie. Donovan closed the car door and began walking up the sloping driveway. His expression was a chilling mask of professional detachment. Derek stood frozen near the bottom of the porch steps, his hands trembling so violently he had to ball them into tight fists. He recognized the high-powered asset protection attorney immediately. Now, the power dynamic was completely and entirely inverted. Donovan approached, stopping just a few feet away from the sweating, terrified man. "Hello, Derek," Donovan said, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "It seems you have had a rather difficult morning trying to access a house you do not own." Derek opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords failed him. Donovan did not wait for a response. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of pristine legal documents. He held the formidable stack out toward Derek. When Derek refused to raise his hands, Donovan simply let the heavy stack drop. The thick bundle hit Derek right in the chest, forcing him to instinctively grab the papers before they could fall to the dirty driveway. "Those are your formal divorce papers," Donovan stated, his tone clipped and precise. "They outline a fault-based filing, citing extreme financial fraud and physical endangerment. You will also find an emergency permanent restraining order prohibiting you from coming within 500 feet of Jasmine or any property she currently occupies." Derek stared down at the legal documents, his eyes wide with horror. He flipped through the pages, seeing his forged documents attached as evidence. Donovan was not finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key attached to a plastic tag. He tossed the key through the air. It hit the pavement, landing next to his scuffed shoes. "Your personal belongings are all sitting in a cheap, unair-conditioned storage facility on the south side of the city," Donovan said coldly. "The key is for Unit 4B. The rent is paid for exactly 1 month. After 30 days, whatever you leave behind will be auctioned off to the highest bidder." Derek looked from the brass key resting on the pavement to the divorce papers in his trembling hands. The totality of his complete destruction was finally sinking in. He had no wife, no house, and no personal possessions left to his name. But the nightmare was only just beginning. As Derek opened his mouth to beg for mercy, the doors of the second black sport utility vehicle suddenly swung open. 4 men stepped out onto the driveway. They wore dark, tactical windbreakers with bold yellow lettering identifying them as federal investigators. They moved with swift, aggressive authority, completely surrounding Derek before he could even register what was happening. The lead agent stepped directly into Derek's personal space. "Are you Derek?" he asked, stating my husband's full legal name with commanding force. Derek could only manage a breathless nod. His legs were shaking so badly, he looked as though he might collapse right there on the concrete. The lead agent reached around to his tactical belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Derek, you are under arrest," the agent declared, his booming voice carrying across the quiet lawns. "You are charged with massive corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud stemming from the theft of client funds at your firm." Barbara, who had been hyperventilating on the grass nearby, let out a piercing, horrific shriek. She lunged forward, trying to reach her son, but one of the federal agents stepped into her path to stop her frantic advance. The lead agent grabbed Derek by the shoulder and spun him around, forcing him to face the vehicle. Derek let out a pathetic, whimpering cry as the agent pressed his chest firmly against the hot metal hood. The agent yanked Derek's arms behind his back, snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around his wrists with a terrifying click. "But we are not just charging you with financial crimes," the agent continued, leaning close to Derek's ear as he patted him down for weapons. "We also secured a warrant for severe insurance fraud regarding the forged $3 million life insurance policy you recently took out on your wife. Furthermore, the local district attorney is preparing to file formal charges of reckless endangerment and attempted manslaughter." Derek twisted his head, desperately trying to look back at the agent. "Attempted manslaughter," he choked out, his voice cracking with pure terror. "That is insane! I did not try to kill anyone!" "We have the smart home access logs," the agent replied calmly. "We know exactly when you shut off the primary water valve. We know you disabled the emergency carbon monoxide detectors right before you locked a severely ill woman inside a house with no power. You built a death trap, and we have the digital fingerprints to prove every step of your plan." The crushing weight of the federal charges hit Derek like a physical blow. His knees completely buckled. The two agents grabbed him by the arms to keep him from collapsing. He was sobbing now, ugly, wet tears streaming down his face, ruining his carefully cultivated image. He thrashed weakly against the strong grip of the investigators, twisting his neck to look frantically toward the grass where his mother and sister were standing. "Mom?" he screamed, his voice echoing with absolute desperate panic. "Mom, call my firm. Call the senior partners. Tell them this is a mistake. Ashley, get your phone. Call a defense lawyer. Now. You have to help me. They are taking me to jail." He expected his mother to rush forward to demand his release and use her arrogant authority to bully the federal agents. He expected his sister to start dialing the best defense attorneys. But when Derek looked through his tear-filled eyes, he realized neither Barbara nor Ashley were moving. They were entirely frozen, standing perfectly still on the manicured green lawn. They were not looking at the federal agents. They were not even looking at Derek as he was shoved aggressively into the back seat of the vehicle. Their eyes were locked in absolute horror on the man standing right in front of them. Donovan had quietly walked over to the grass while the arrest was taking place. He stood before the two terrified women, his expression radiating pure disgust. He reached inside his tailored jacket one final time. He pulled out two separate manila envelopes and shoved them into Barbara and Ashley's trembling hands. The women stared down at the heavy documents, their faces draining of whatever color they had left. "What is this?" Barbara whispered, her voice a hollow squeak. "Those are formal civil lawsuits," Donovan said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Jasmine is suing both of you for your direct complicity in the life insurance fraud and the theft of the embezzled corporate funds you used to finance your European vacation. We have frozen all of your personal banking accounts, too." Derek screamed for his mother one last time as the heavy steel doors of the federal vehicle slammed shut completely, cutting off his voice. Barbara and Ashley were left standing on the curb, staring in absolute, utter disbelief at the lawsuits that would effectively destroy the rest of their lives. The federal vehicle carrying Derek rolled away from the driveway, but his screams seemed to remain in the hot air after the taillights disappeared. For several seconds, Barbara and Ashley stood motionless beside their luggage. Then Barbara looked down at the civil complaint in her hands and finally read the first page. The document listed transfers from Derek's shell companies into accounts bearing her name. Dates, amounts, and purchases were arranged in columns so simple that even denial could not obscure them. Her shock turned instantly into rage. She spun toward the road as though Derek could still hear her through the closed vehicle. "You lied to me!" she screamed. "You said the money came from bonuses! You said the firm was rewarding you!" Her voice cracked as she shouted that he had destroyed the family name and made her look like a thief in front of everyone she respected. Minutes earlier, she had been demanding that agents release her innocent son. Now that she understood her own accounts were exposed, she spoke of him as if he had acted alone. Ashley stared at the complaint attached to her envelope. Her white sports car apartment, deposits yacht expenses, and designer purchases appeared beside transfers from fictitious vendors. She began tearing through the pages, searching for a sentence that would separate her from the consequences. There was none. She had signed acknowledgments describing several deposits as consulting income, even though she had never performed work for Derek's firm. "This cannot be real," she whispered. "Derek told me it was family money." Donovan remained beside the first vehicle, watching them without sympathy. "Family money does not come from retired clients whose accounts were charged for services they never received," he said. "The records will determine what each of you knew. Until then, you are prohibited from moving, selling, or concealing any asset identified in those complaints." Barbara rounded on him. She demanded that he call me immediately. Her tone shifted from outrage to desperate entitlement. She said I was still Derek's wife and therefore responsible for protecting the family from public humiliation. She insisted that I had always been too sensitive, that the European trip had merely been a misunderstanding, and that no respectable daughter-in-law would allow federal agents to drag her husband away. Donovan let her finish. Then he asked one quiet question. Where was that concern when Jasmine was locked inside a house without medication, water power, or a telephone? Barbara opened her mouth, but no answer came. The new owner and his wife watched through the front window. Neighbors had gathered at a distance, pretending to walk dogs or check mail, while recording the scene on their phones. For a woman who built her life around appearances, there was no private corner left in which to hide. Ashley suddenly rushed toward Donovan. She abandoned her suitcase in the grass and grabbed at the sleeve of his jacket before he stepped back. "Please," she said, "tell Jasmine I am sorry. Tell her I did not know Derek was trying to hurt her. We were angry because she was ruining the trip. We said things, but that does not mean we wanted her dead. Tell me where she is. I need to explain. We are family." Donovan's expression did not change. "You lost the right to use that word 36 days ago." The sentence struck harder than shouting. Ashley's hands dropped to her sides. Barbara began crying, but even her tears carried accusation. She blamed Derek for being weak, Ashley for spending too much, and me for refusing to remain obedient. Ashley fired back that Barbara had praised every purchase and encouraged Derek to control me. Their alliance dissolved in less than a minute. Each tried to place the ugliest decisions on the other, while the evidence in their hands showed how eagerly both had benefited. Barbara accused Ashley of pushing for the yacht, the private suites, and the designer shopping. Ashley reminded her that Barbara had demanded a longer trip because she wanted photographs from Paris, Monaco, and Milan for the country club newsletter. Barbara then claimed she had never seen Derek's banking records. Ashley shouted that ignorance was not innocence when Barbara had personally instructed her to classify the deposits as consulting income. Every defense exposed another fact, for the neighbors' phones and Donovan's camera to record. A process server approached with separate notices preserving their phones and cloud accounts. Both women instinctively clutched their devices. The server warned them that deleting messages, photographs, or financial applications after receiving notice could be treated as destruction of evidence. Ashley's face changed. She had spent the entire trip posting timestamps, locations, purchases, and captions that connected the stolen funds to their benefit. Her carefully curated social media life had become an investigator's index. Barbara tried one last time to recover control by ordering Ashley to stop speaking. Ashley laughed bitterly and asked why she should obey a woman who had encouraged every insult directed at me. The argument exposed the truth beneath their polished family image. Loyalty had never been based on love. It lasted only while money flowed and someone else absorbed the blame. Once the money disappeared, so did the performance of unity. The taxi driver who had waited because their luggage still occupied his trunk stepped out and demanded payment for the extra time. Derek had used the last of their cash on the original fare. Barbara reached for a card before remembering every account listed in the complaint had been frozen. She offered the driver a bracelet as collateral. He refused and removed the final suitcases from the trunk, leaving them on the curb before driving away. Barbara called 3 friends from her country club. The first sent her to voicemail. The second answered, listened for less than 20 seconds, and ended the call after saying she did not want to be involved in a federal case. The third number had already blocked her. Ashley tried to order a ride through her phone, but the application rejected every stored card. They stood in the heat beside thousands of dollars of designer luggage and could not purchase a 10-minute trip across town. Donovan returned to his vehicle. Before closing the door, he reminded them that all communication with me had to pass through counsel and that violating the protective order would create additional consequences. Barbara demanded to know whether he expected 2 women to remain stranded on a public sidewalk. "I expect you to solve your own problem," he replied. Jasmine had to solve hers while she was dying. The vehicle pulled away. Barbara and Ashley were left alone, outside a house they had treated as their private estate, but had never owned. The new owner placed the sold sign upright near the garage, then shut the blinds. With nowhere else to go, the 2 women dragged their luggage toward the nearest bus stop. Behind them, the empty stretch of driveway looked cleaner than it had in years. From my penthouse, I watched the secure feed until they disappeared at the end of the street. Only then did I close the window and begin the next phase, recovering every stolen dollar Derek had placed in their names. From the quiet sanctuary of my new downtown penthouse, I watched the spectacular collapse unfold in glorious high definition. Donovan had discreetly positioned a small encrypted camera on the dashboard of his vehicle, allowing me a perfect, unobstructed view of my former driveway. I watched Barbara sway on her expensive heels, clutching the thick stack of legal documents to her chest, as if trying to physically hold her shattered reality together. Ashley was frozen beside her, staring blankly at the retreating taillights of the federal transport vehicle that was currently carrying her brother away in handcuffs. The sheer, absolute silence of my living room stood in stark contrast to the utter devastation playing out on the illuminated screen. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my chamomile tea, feeling the warm, soothing liquid ease the lingering rawness in my healing throat. I was not finished yet. While they were busy absorbing the initial shock of the civil lawsuits, I was already executing the next highly calculated phase of my retaliation. Derek had not just funded their European vacation with stolen corporate money. Over the past 3 years, he had systematically funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars in embezzled funds directly into the personal banking accounts of his mother and his sister to finance their extravagant high society lifestyles. As a senior forensic accountant, tracing that stolen money was practically second nature to me. I had already filed emergency subpoenas to freeze their personal assets and reclaim every single stolen dollar. Down on the curb, the reality of their situation forced them into frantic, panicked motion. Barbara, her hands shaking violently, managed to pull her cell phone from her designer purse. She immediately dialed the private concierge desk at her elite country club, desperately demanding they send a luxury car to pick them up and arrange a temporary suite. I watched her posture stiffen as the concierge delivered the devastating news. I had already contacted the financial board of the club earlier that morning, providing them with the indisputable documentation of the federal indictment of Derek and the freezing of the accounts belonging to Barbara. The country club operated on strict social standing and impeccable financial credentials. They had permanently revoked her membership effective immediately. Barbara dropped her phone onto the grass, letting out a strangled cry of pure humiliation. The facade she had spent decades meticulously building was completely shattered. She realized she had absolutely no friends left to call. Every single bridge had been entirely burned. Ashley fared no better. With no money for a taxi and their accounts entirely locked, they were forced to drag their heavy luggage to a nearby bus stop in the sweltering heat. They stood on the dirty sidewalk, swatting away insects and sweating through their expensive imported clothing. But the consequences of living on stolen money were moving far faster than they could run. Later that same afternoon, I received a notification on my tablet from the asset recovery firm I had hired. The pristine white luxury sports car belonging to Ashley, the one she constantly flaunted on social media as proof of her independent success, had just been formally repossessed. The recovery agents had located it in the parking garage of her upscale downtown apartment building. They hitched it to a tow truck right in front of her wealthy neighbors and dragged it away while she was still stuck riding a crowded public bus. The vehicle had been purchased entirely with the dirty money Derek had transferred to her, and it was now officially seized as part of the federal investigation. They were learning the hard way that when you build an empire on stolen funds, the repossession is absolute and entirely merciless. There would be absolutely no second chances for either of them. While his mother and sister were being stripped of their unearned luxuries, Derek was experiencing his own profound descent into absolute ruin. The federal agents had transported him directly to a downtown holding facility, processing him through the cold, sterile machinery of the criminal justice system. They stripped him of his wrinkled designer linen suit, confiscating his belt, shoelaces, and personal effects. He was issued a stiff, scratchy institutional uniform and placed inside a stark, concrete holding cell with a maximum occupancy of 10 other, deeply unpleasant individuals. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing with terrifying finality against the cinder block walls. The reality of his environment was a brutal sensory shock. The cell smelled of industrial bleach and stale sweat, a nauseating contrast to the Michelin-starred restaurants and private yachts he had been enjoying just a day prior. He sat alone, shivering in the cold, damp air of the holding facility, entirely stripped of his false, arrogant swagger. Derek sat on the edge of a cold metal bench, his head buried in his trembling hands. His mind raced, frantically searching for a loophole. A clever excuse or a charismatic lie that could possibly explain away the massive mountain of digital evidence stacked against him. But there was no charming his way out of federal embezzlement charges. And there was certainly no smooth-talking his way out of the meticulously forged $3 million life insurance policy. His usual arrogance, however, refused to die completely. A dark, venomous anger began to bubble up through his crushing panic. He convinced himself that I was the sole architect of his misery. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, if I had simply died quietly in the heat of that suburban house, none of this would be happening. He refused to accept any responsibility for his own horrific actions. He was allowed exactly one phone call to secure legal representation or contact a family member. He did not call a defense attorney. He did not call his mother. He marched up to the scarred metal telephone mounted on the cinder block wall, his fingers violently punching in my personal cell phone number. He fully expected the call to go straight to my digital voicemail. He planned to leave a vicious, threatening message, demanding that I call off my ruthless asset protection lawyer and drop the civil lawsuits immediately. He wanted to scream at me, to remind me that he was the man of the house and that I was nothing without him. He wanted me to fix the massive disaster he had created. He gripped the heavy plastic receiver, pressing it hard against his ear as the phone line began to ring. His heart pounded heavily in his chest, fueled by desperate anger. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3 rings. Derek squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the familiar beep of the recording machine so he could unleash his absolute fury. But the beep never came. Instead, the ringing abruptly stopped, followed by a brief, hollow click. The line was open. I sat in the quiet comfort of my penthouse looking down at my phone. I had intentionally unblocked his number just moments before, knowing the federal processing timeline and anticipating his desperate need to exert control. The phone glowed brightly in my hand, displaying the incoming call from the correctional facility. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the total silence fill the room. I pressed the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. For several long, agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the harsh, raspy sound of Derek breathing heavily on the other end of the line. The connection carried the faint metallic echo of the federal holding facility, a stark and unforgiving acoustic backdrop that contrasted beautifully with the soft classical music playing quietly in my luxurious penthouse. I could hear the muffled shouts of other inmates in the background, a chaotic symphony of the criminal justice system grinding away. Derek was waiting for me to speak, to yell, to demand an explanation, or hurl insults. He was waiting for the emotional reaction he had always used to manipulate me. When I offered him nothing but absolute silence, his fragile nerve finally broke. "Jasmine," he gasped, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate pitch I had never heard from him before. "Oh my God, Jasmine, please tell me you are there. Please say something to me." I took a slow sip of my tea, leaning back into the plush, velvet cushions of my sofa. I did not utter a single syllable. I just let him drown in the heavy silence. "Jasmine, please, you have to listen to me," he begged, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic, rushed panic. "This is all a massive misunderstanding. You have to call Donovan and tell him to stop. You have to call the federal prosecutors and tell them they have it all wrong. They locked me in a concrete cell, Jasmine. They took my clothes. You have to pay my bail. I cannot stay in here. You know I cannot handle a place like this." His sheer audacity was genuinely fascinating to witness. Even now, sitting in a federal holding cell, facing a mountain of undeniable cryptographic evidence, his immediate instinct was to command me to fix his problems. He still viewed me as his convenient problem solver, his personal human shield against the consequences of his own disastrous actions. "I made a terrible mistake," Derek sobbed, his voice breaking into ugly, wet tears. "I was under so much stress at the investment firm. The market was crashing and the senior partners were putting impossible pressure on me. I panicked, Jasmine. I just panicked, and I made a stupid, terrible mistake. But you know I love you. You are my wife. We took vows to protect each other. You cannot just leave me in here to rot. I just wanted to give us a beautiful life," he continued, weaving a delusional narrative that completely ignored the reality of his massive corporate theft and attempted murder. "I wanted to take care of you and provide for our family. The money I moved around at work, it was just a temporary loan. I was going to put every single dollar back before anyone even noticed. And the house? Jasmine, I did not know the air conditioning was going to get that hot. I thought you would just go stay at a hotel for a few days. I was just frustrated that you ruined the European trip. I was stressed out and I lost my temper. But I never wanted you to actually get hurt. Please, you have to believe me. I love you so much. We can get past this. We can go to counseling. Just post my bail and we will figure everything out together. I promise I will change." I listened to his entire pathetic monologue without interrupting once. I let him exhaust himself, let him pour every single drop of his manipulative poison into the phone receiver. When he finally fell silent, panting and sniffling into the metal mouthpiece, I let another long, punishing moment of total silence stretch across the line. "Derek," I said, my voice chillingly calm and entirely devoid of any human emotion whatsoever. "Yes," he gasped, eager and desperate, grasping at the sound of my voice like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. "Yes, I am here, baby. Tell me you will call the lawyers. Tell me you will fix this." I stood up from my velvet sofa and walked slowly over to the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the glittering skyline of downtown Chicago, watching the steady stream of headlights moving along the busy expressways below. "You did not make a mistake, Derek," I said, speaking with a slow, deliberate cadence that ensured he absorbed the absolute finality of every single word. A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill or missing a scheduled flight. What you did was not a mistake. You made a calculation. "No, Jasmine, please," he whimpered, trying to interrupt. I kept my voice perfectly level, cutting through his pathetic pleas with surgical precision. "You made a conscious, deliberate calculation. You went down to the basement and you manually turned off the primary water valve, knowing I was suffering from a severe fever. You walked over to the electrical panel and you completely severed the power to the house. You took my emergency inhaler from my nightstand. You confiscated my cell phone so I could not call an ambulance. You engaged the smart locks to trap me inside a 90-degree oven. And then, you deliberately disabled the carbon monoxide detectors, just in case the sweltering heat and extreme dehydration were not enough to finish the job." He was completely silent now. The desperate sobbing had stopped abruptly, replaced by a terrified, breathless paralysis. He realized that I knew absolutely everything. Every single detail of his horrific, premeditated plan was completely laid bare. "You forged my signature on a $3 million life insurance policy," I continued, my tone remaining as cold and unyielding as a sheet of solid winter ice. "You planned out my funeral while you were packing your designer luggage for a luxury vacation in Monaco. You funded that vacation using millions of dollars you blatantly stole from your own corporate clients. You built an entire empire of lies, and you thought you were the smartest person in the room? You thought you could commit massive federal fraud and walk away without a single scratch." "Jasmine, please," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently it barely registered over the phone line. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I am not interested in your apologies, Derek," I stated flatly. "I am not interested in your manufactured tears or your pathetic excuses about corporate stress. The only mistake that was made in this entire situation was yours." I paused, letting the heavy weight of the moment settle squarely on his narrow shoulders. "The only mistake you made was underestimating the woman you tried to kill." I did not wait for him to respond. I did not want to hear another single word he had to say for the rest of my natural life. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, immediately terminating the connection. The line went instantly dead. I opened my phone settings, navigated to the security dashboard, and permanently blocked the number associated with the Federal Correctional Facility. I then blocked every other incoming number routing from the county jail system, ensuring that Derek would never be able to reach my personal device ever again. He was completely and utterly severed from my existence. Back in the cold, damp cinder block holding cell, Derek stood perfectly still, his hand gripping the heavy plastic receiver of the institutional telephone. He stared blankly at the scarred metal wall directly in front of him. The harsh, buzzing sound of a disconnected dial tone echoed loudly in his ear, a mechanical drone that signaled the absolute end of his entire world. He slowly lowered the receiver, his fingers numb and entirely unresponsive. He let the plastic phone drop, letting it dangle from its short armored cord against the concrete wall. He turned around and looked at the cramped, miserable cell that would serve as his reality for the foreseeable future. The smell of industrial bleach and stale sweat hit him with a fresh wave of severe nausea. The other inmates in the holding facility ignored him completely, going about their grim routines with hardened indifference. Derek stumbled backward, his legs finally giving out beneath him. He collapsed onto the cold metal bench, his shoulders slumping heavily under the crushing, unimaginable weight of his situation. There would be no high-priced defense attorney swooping in to save him. There would be no secret offshore accounts waiting to fund his legal bail. His mother and sister were currently standing on a suburban sidewalk, completely bankrupt and utterly powerless, facing their own massive civil lawsuits. He had absolutely no one left to manipulate and nowhere left to run. The federal prosecutors had an ironclad digital dossier detailing his massive corporate embezzlement, and the evidence regarding the forged life insurance policy was entirely indisputable. He was not looking at a slap on the wrist or a brief stint in a minimum security white-collar facility. He was looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of at least 15 years in a harsh federal penitentiary. 15 years of his life entirely gone. The reality of his impending massive prison sentence crashed down upon him like a collapsing brick wall, finally crushing the last remaining fragments of his arrogant ego into absolute dust. He buried his face in his hands and wept. 3 weeks after Derek's arrest, the civil and criminal cases converged in a preliminary deposition held in a secured conference room at the federal courthouse. Derek attended in custody, wearing a plain institutional uniform beneath a borrowed jacket his attorney had requested for the record. The attempt at dignity failed. His face looked gray, his hair had lost its careful shape, and the confidence that once filled every room had collapsed into restless movements of his hands. I sat across the table beside Donovan. A protective partition separated us, and 2 marshals stood near the door. I had considered giving my testimony remotely, but I chose to be present. Derek had spent years relying on my discomfort to silence me. I wanted the official record to contain my voice steady and unafraid. His defense attorney began politely, then shifted toward the strategy we expected. He asked whether I had resented the European trip, whether marital disagreements had made me angry, and whether my professional skills gave me the ability to manipulate electronic records. The implication was clear. If he could portray me as a vindictive forensic accountant with access to sophisticated software, he could suggest the evidence had been manufactured as revenge. I answered only what was asked. Yes, I objected to being abandoned while severely ill. No, I had not altered Derek's records. Every file had been preserved by independent custodians, verified through cryptographic hashes, and obtained again through subpoenas issued directly to the banks, insurer, smart home provider, and investment firm. My personal copy was not the foundation of the case. It was the map that showed investigators where to look. The attorney displayed a message in which I told Donovan that I wanted Derek's life dismantled. He read the sentence slowly, hoping it sounded like a confession of malicious intent. Donovan asked that the entire exchange be shown. The next lines instructed him to preserve evidence, avoid unauthorized transfers, and use only court-approved methods to protect my assets. The dramatic phrase lost its force when surrounded by the legal precautions I had demanded. Then the defense attorney claimed Derek believed I could leave the house whenever I wished. He suggested the smart locks were intended only to protect the property while the family traveled. Donovan placed a certified report from the lock manufacturer on the table. The report showed that Derek had activated exterior deadbolts revoked, my user credential disabled, emergency access, and tested the setting from his airport lounge. The timestamp occurred 27 minutes after he took my phone. The attorney tried another direction. He said the medicine might have been misplaced during packing. Donovan opened the inventory photographs taken by the bonded moving service. The inhaler appeared beneath Derek's folded shirts. The antibiotics were sealed inside his toiletry case. Both items had been photographed in place, logged by 2 employees, and transferred to investigators without passing through my hands. Derek shifted in his chair. For the first time, he stopped looking at his lawyer and looked directly at me. He seemed to be waiting for anger tears or some sign that the man I married still had access to my emotions. I felt nothing, except the calm focus I brought to any difficult audit. His attorney requested a break. Before anyone stood, Donovan said there was one more exhibit relevant to the family's claim that the trip was an innocent vacation disrupted by an unstable spouse. He played Barbara's voicemail from Paris. "You spiteful, useless wife," her recorded voice screamed through the conference room speakers. "Fix this immediately, or Derek is leaving you." The recording continued through every insult, demand, and threat. Barbara was not in the room, but her contempt filled it. The defense attorney's expression tightened. The message proved that the family believed I remained trapped and ill, yet their only concern was restoring access to money. Next came the life insurance file. A representative from the insurer had produced the original electronic application, the IP address used to submit it, and the identity verification video Derek had attempted to bypass with a still image of my driver's license. The handwriting expert's report confirmed the signature was not mine. The policy change occurred 4 days before the utilities were shut off. The prosecutor then introduced a timeline created from independent records rather than my personal computer. It showed Derek entering the basement, the water service dropping to 0, the electrical panel sending a shutdown alert, and the smart home account revoking my credential. Airport security placed him at the departure gate less than an hour later. His phone connected to the lounge network and tested the lock status twice before boarding. No single fact depended on my memory. The companies that operated the systems had supplied each record directly. Derek leaned toward his attorney and whispered urgently. The attorney asked whether the records could have been triggered by routine maintenance. The smart home representative answered that routine maintenance could not remove one resident's emergency access or disable safety detectors. Those commands required deliberate selections followed by Derek's biometric confirmation. The room became silent except for the court reporter's keys. Donovan asked that Derek's handwritten note be marked as the next exhibit. A document examiner had matched the ink and handwriting to notes seized from Derek's office. The defense could no longer call it a cruel joke written in anger, because its instructions matched the digital commands executed minutes later. The note, the devices, and the insurance application formed one continuous plan. Derek lowered his eyes and did not look up again until the recess. The attorney stopped taking notes. He asked for another recess this time, with the prosecutor and Donovan. Through the glass wall, I watched him speak to Derek in the corridor. Derek argued, pointed toward me, and shook his head repeatedly. His attorney responded with short, forceful sentences. When they returned, the defense abandoned the claim that I had fabricated the evidence. Counsel stated that he would begin discussions regarding a plea agreement. The deposition ended shortly before sunset. I left with Donovan through the public hallway while marshals prepared to return Derek to custody. Barbara was waiting near the elevators, despite being instructed to communicate through counsel. Her expensive clothes were gone. She wore a plain coat, and the strain of the past weeks had aged her face. She stepped into my path, then dropped to her knees before security could intervene. "Jasmine, please," she said. "They are taking everything. I have nowhere to live. Stop the lawsuits. Let me keep something." She did not ask whether my lungs had healed. She did not apologize for leaving me without medicine. Her plea was still about money. Donovan moved to block her, but I raised one hand. I looked at Barbara long enough for her to understand that I had heard every word. Then I stepped around her without answering. Behind me, she called my name and began to sob. The elevator doors closed between us. In the mirrored wall, I saw my own face, not angry, not triumphant, simply free. Derek's attorney had finally accepted that the case could not be won. I had accepted something even more important. I no longer needed any of them to understand what they had done before I walked away. While Derek sat in that freezing concrete cell, weeping over the absolute destruction of his arrogant illusion, I was already moving forward with cold, clinical efficiency. The divorce proceedings were finalized with a speed that left his high-priced legal team completely stunned and entirely powerless. Because of the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence proving his massive financial fraud and his meticulously documented attempt on my life, the family court judge showed absolutely no mercy whatsoever. I sat perfectly upright next to Donovan in the quiet, polished mahogany courtroom as the final decree was signed. Derek was not even permitted to attend the civil hearing in person due to his ongoing federal custody status and the severe flight risk he posed. His court-appointed defense attorney barely put up a fight, knowing any argument would be immediately crushed by the paper trail I had secured. I was granted full, unrestricted ownership of all my private corporate assets, while Derek was legally stripped of any potential claim to my wealth. The marriage was completely dissolved, effectively erasing his parasitic presence from my life with the swift stroke of a judge pen. I walked out of that courthouse feeling an immense, crushing weight finally lifting off my shoulders. I was no longer a victim trapped in a toxic web of deceit. I was a survivor who had fought back and won entirely on my own terms. The federal criminal case against Derek moved with the same crushing inevitability. Faced with the undeniable cryptographic proof I had extracted from his hidden offshore accounts, his defense team realized a lengthy public trial would only result in a much harsher punishment and prolonged media humiliation. They strongly advised him to take a blind plea deal, hoping for a tiny shred of leniency from the strict federal magistrate. On the crisp autumn morning of his formal sentencing, I deliberately chose not to attend. I had absolutely no desire to see his pathetic face or hear his manufactured crying ever again. Donovan attended the hearing on my behalf and called me later that afternoon with the final verdict. The federal judge had looked at the sheer, calculated cruelty of the life insurance forgery, combined with the massive theft of millions in vulnerable client funds, and handed down a truly staggering sentence. Derek was officially sentenced to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary, without the slightest possibility of early parole or sentence reduction. He would be well into his 50s by the time he ever saw the outside world again. His youth, his arrogant charm, and his elite status completely and permanently squandered behind thick concrete walls. His mother and sister faced their own brutal, unforgiving reckoning. My relentless civil lawsuits systematically dismantled their entire fraudulent existence, piece by piece. The state courts granted my legal team full authorization to seize the stolen corporate funds Derek had secretly funneled into their personal bank accounts over the past 3 years. The rapid, aggressive seizure of their assets forced Barbara and Ashley into immediate and total bankruptcy. The luxury cars were gone repossessed in broad daylight. The extensive designer wardrobes and expensive jewelry collections were auctioned off to pay their mounting legal fees and court-mandated restitution. They were formally evicted from their high-rise luxury apartment building and forced to relocate to a cramped, run-down, low-income housing complex on the dirty industrial edge of the city. The elite high society circles they had once desperately clung to completely shunned them overnight. Former friends blocked their phone numbers, and wealthy country club acquaintances pretended not to know them if they crossed paths in the local discount grocery store. Barbara, who had spent her entire adult life judging others for their lack of wealth and status, was now forced to clip paper coupons just to survive the month. Ashley had to swallow her massive pride and take a minimum wage retail job, dealing with angry customers and standing on her aching feet for 10 grueling hours a day. Their glamorous European dream had permanently mutated into an inescapable daily nightmare of poverty and profound social isolation. While they descended into absolute ruin, I continued to rise higher than I ever thought possible. My meticulous handling of the embezzlement discovery had deeply impressed the senior board members at my firm. They recognized my ruthless efficiency, my brilliant analytical skills, and my unwavering commitment to corporate asset protection. Just 2 months after the divorce was officially finalized, I was called into the main executive boardroom and offered a massive promotion. I accepted the prestigious position of senior partner, making me one of the youngest women in the firm long history to reach that elite level. My salary tripled overnight, and my professional reputation became absolutely legendary within the downtown financial district. But I knew that true power was not just about accumulating vast personal wealth. It was about using that leverage to create meaningful, lasting change for others who were suffering. I took a significant portion of my newly expanded wealth and established a comprehensive legal defense fund. The private foundation was specifically designed to provide elite legal representation, forensic accounting services, and safe financial exit strategies for women who were trapped in dangerously abusive marriages. I partnered with Donovan and several other top-tier family law attorneys, ensuring that vulnerable women would never have to feel as helpless, suffocated, and terrified as I had felt in that sweltering suburban house. The sheer volume of desperate calls we received during the very first week of operation proved exactly how desperately this exact type of aggressive financial intervention was needed in our society. I poured my heart and soul into ensuring that these brave survivors had the unlimited resources required to fight back against the monstrous men who had systematically attempted to destroy their bright, beautiful lives. I spent my busy days empowering others, and my quiet evenings enjoying the pristine, peaceful sanctuary I had built entirely for myself. I stood in the center of my new upgraded penthouse suite, looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, brightly illuminated city skyline. The central air conditioning hummed a soft, perfect rhythm, wrapping me in a constant, comfortable, cool breeze that felt like absolute luxury against my skin. My lungs expanded effortlessly, drawing in deep, healthy breaths of purified air, without a single trace of a cough or a painful wheeze. My body had completely healed, matching the impenetrable strength of my mind. I walked slowly over to the gleaming marble surface of my pristine kitchen island, where a delicate crystal glass of highly expensive vintage wine was waiting for me. I picked up the smooth glass, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. The rich, complex flavors danced across my tongue, a perfect celebration of my hard-won freedom from his suffocating grip. I looked down at the bustling city streets far below me, entirely safe, entirely wealthy, and completely untouchable. Derek had planned to leave me to perish in the dark, believing his cruel ambition would easily erase my entire existence. Instead, his monumental greed had handed me the exact keys to unlock my own limitless potential. I smiled, letting the quiet luxury of my beautiful new life wash over me. The horrific nightmare was officially and permanently over. I had finally won the ultimate game. My story is a glorious new beginning for me right here today. A full year passed since federal agents took Derek away in handcuffs. I sat in a private leather booth at the most exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago. The ambient lighting was low and warm, casting a golden glow over the crystal glasses and silver cutlery spread across our table. I was surrounded by my new peers, fellow senior partners and elite financial investigators who had just helped me close the largest corporate liquidation case in our firm's history. It was a massive victory that cemented my reputation not just as a survivor, but as an absolute force of nature in the financial sector. Donovan was seated to my right, looking relaxed and genuinely happy as he ordered another bottle of vintage champagne for the table. The air was filled with the sounds of quiet, sophisticated celebration, clinking glasses, low laughter, and the steady hum of powerful people enjoying the fruits of their immense labor. I took a deep breath, letting the sheer joy of the moment settle into my bones. The contrast between this elegant, triumphant evening and the suffocating nightmare I endured a year ago could not have been more profound. Back then, I was gasping for a single breath on the floor of a dark closet, isolated and left to die by the man who promised to protect me. Tonight, I was breathing freely, completely untouchable, and sitting at the very top of my profession. I spent the last 12 months pouring my energy into my career and the legal defense fund I established for victims of financial abuse. I watched terrified, vulnerable women walk into my office and leave with the resources they needed to reclaim their entire lives. Helping them fight back healed the last remaining scars of my own ordeal. I did not carry any lingering anger or bitterness. The heavy, toxic weight of Derek and his awful family had been lifted from my shoulders, leaving behind nothing but a clear, cold focus and a deep appreciation for the beautiful, independent life I constructed from the ashes. As the waiter poured the fresh champagne, my eyes naturally drifted across the crowded dining room. I watched the graceful choreography of the restaurant staff moving efficiently between the tables. That was when a specific movement caught my attention. Near the back of the room, by the heavy swinging doors leading into the kitchen, a woman was furiously clearing an abandoned table. She struggled to balance a massive black plastic tray loaded with dirty plates, half-eaten steaks, and empty wine glasses. She wore the standard uniform of the bus staff, a plain black button-down shirt and a dark apron, but her clothes were wrinkled and heavily stained with spilled sauce. Her blonde hair, which used to be flawlessly maintained and professionally styled every week, was now pulled back into a messy, greasy knot at the base of her neck. She looked incredibly thin, her shoulders hunched forward under the physical strain of the heavy tray. There was a bone-deep exhaustion radiating from her entire posture. As she bent down to retrieve a linen napkin from the carpet, the dim light from a nearby wall sconce illuminated her face. It was Ashley, the very same woman who had lounged on a multi-million-dollar private yacht in Monaco, mocking my illness while sipping imported champagne. The entitled, arrogant sister-in-law who had treated me like absolute garbage simply because I worked for a living, rather than relying on an unearned allowance. Now she worked scrubbing dirty plates and wiping down tables for minimum wage to survive the crushing reality of her complete bankruptcy. The luxurious European summer was a distant, dead memory, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the service industry. As she straightened up, balancing the heavy tray on her hip, she paused to wipe a bead of sweat from her forehead. In that brief moment, her tired eyes scanned across the restaurant and landed directly on my booth. The physical reaction was immediate and absolutely jarring. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. We maintained direct eye contact across the busy dining room for 3 agonizing seconds. In her wide, panicked eyes, I saw the shattering of her entire ego. The profound, crushing shame washed over her as she realized exactly who was sitting in the VIP booth watching her clear dirty dishes. She did not see a victim. She saw the wealthy senior partner who single-handedly dismantled her false empire. I did not offer a smile. I did not glare or offer any sign of malice. I simply looked at her with utter, detached indifference. Ashley immediately broke direct eye contact, ducking her blonde head down so incredibly low that her chin practically touched her chest. Her hands shook violently as she grabbed the edge of her heavy tray and sprinted through the swinging kitchen doors, desperate to hide her burning humiliation in the back room. I did not feel the need to follow her, or demand an apology. I did not need to gloat at all. The universe had already delivered the exact punishing justice that she deserved. Donovan noticed my distraction and leaned over, following my line of sight toward the kitchen. "Is everything all right, Jasmine?" he asked, his tone protective. "Did you see someone you know?" I turned back to the polished table, looking at the supportive faces of the brilliant, dedicated colleagues who genuinely valued my mind and respected my journey. I slowly reached out and wrapped my fingers securely around the delicate, chilled stem of my crystal glass. Everything is absolutely perfect tonight, Donovan, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely serene. I raised my tall glass of expensive vintage champagne, holding it high in the center of the crowded table. I confidently proposed a toast to our monumental corporate victory, to the unbreakable, unyielding strength we had successfully built, and to a beautiful, truly unburdened future. After Ashley disappeared through the kitchen doors, the celebration continued without interruption. No one at my table asked for gossip or encouraged me to enjoy her humiliation. They returned to discussing the case we had won, the clients whose funds had been recovered, and the young investigators whose work deserved recognition. That ordinary respect mattered more to me than any dramatic confrontation. It confirmed that my life was no longer organized around Derek's family or the damage they had caused. When dinner ended, Donovan offered to have a car take me home. I accepted, and we rode through downtown Chicago beneath a clear autumn sky. The city looked different from the one I had watched through the hospital window a year earlier. Back then, every light represented another task in a battle I had not chosen. Tonight, the lights belonged to a city in which I had built work friendships and safety on my own terms. At the entrance to my building, Donovan paused before leaving. He told me the foundation had approved emergency funding for 3 more women that week. One needed a forensic review of accounts her husband had hidden. Another required a secure apartment after discovering her spouse had emptied their savings. The third had finally obtained an attorney after years of being told she could never afford to leave. Their cases were confidential, but the result was not. Preparation had given each woman a choice. That was the legacy I wanted from the worst 36 days of my life. Not Derek's sentence, not Barbara's bankruptcy, not the image of Ashley carrying dirty plates. I wanted the survival system built after my escape to keep opening doors for people who believed every exit had been sealed. I rode the elevator alone to the top floor. Inside my penthouse, the air was cool and quiet. I placed my keys on the kitchen island beside a single crystal glass, opened a bottle of wine, and poured only enough for a slow, final toast. Then I unlocked the balcony doors. The night air touched my face as I stepped outside. Far below, traffic moved in ribbons of white and red. The lake was a dark sheet beyond the buildings, and the wind carried the clean, sharp scent of approaching winter. I rested both hands on the railing and drew a deep breath. Air filled my lungs easily. There was no stabbing pain beneath my ribs. No fever. No desperate search for an inhaler that had been hidden from me. I did not have to measure the distance to a locked door or calculate how long my body could survive without water. I could breathe as deeply as I wished, and the simple freedom of it still felt extraordinary. For months, I had remembered the house as a tomb Derek constructed around me. He turned off the power, removed my medicine, stole my phone, and trusted heat and silence to complete his plan. He believed control meant deciding whether I had access to light, water, money, and help. But the trap exposed the one thing he never understood. Independence is not a performance. It is a structure built quietly before a crisis, through knowledge, protected assets, trusted allies, and the refusal to surrender every key to another person. My final pulmonary examination had taken place that morning. The specialist compared the new scans with the images taken when I arrived at the hospital and told me the damage had healed without permanent loss of function. I thanked her, then sat in my car for several minutes after the appointment, overwhelmed by the ordinary miracle of a future measured in decades rather than hours. The medical file was closed, but I kept the original oxygen mask in a sealed box at the Foundation office. It reminded me why access to emergency help could never be treated as a privilege controlled by a spouse. The 36 days Derek expected to end with my funeral became the period in which his false empire destroyed itself. Each day he remained abroad gave investigators more time to preserve evidence. Each arrogant purchase created another financial trail. Every threat he sent became part of the record. The distance he believed protected him allowed me to separate my life from his without interference. I did not pretend betrayal was a gift. Nearly dying was not a blessing, and survival did not erase the fear of waking in that dark room. But I could choose what happened after it. I turned the evidence into freedom, the freedom into resources, and the resources into protection for other women. Derek tried to reduce my life to a $3 million insurance payment. Instead, he forced me to recognize the value of everything he could never own. I lifted the glass and looked across the skyline. Somewhere beyond those buildings, women supported by our foundation were entering safe homes, meeting attorneys, and opening accounts in their own names. That knowledge settled into me with more warmth than revenge ever could. Derek thought he was locking me inside a grave. In reality, he handed me the final proof I needed to leave him. The evidence that dismantled his crimes, and the keys to an empire built entirely on my own judgment. I took another full, effortless breath and smiled. The city did not belong to me because I controlled every building or light. It belonged to me because I could move through it without fear, choose where I lived, decide whom I trusted, and use my power without asking permission. I raised my glass to the open night, then turned back toward the home I had chosen for myself. The balcony doors remained open behind me. Cool air moved freely through the penthouse, touching every room. Nothing was locked, nothing was hidden, and for the first time in years, neither was I.